people who talk about indigenous rights in the global sense very seldom trouble to explain what exactly they mean by that, who they consider to be indigenous people. I mean, to give you an example, I was out in the Western Isles of Scotland earlier this year. On the Isles of Lewis and Harris. And that's where it's the only place in the world where you can produce Harris tweed, one of the finest and best reputed fabric products that you can acquire anywhere in the world at this point. And that, of course, is made from the wool of sheep. And it's a traditional craft, and it's been going back generation upon generation. Now, are we to say that for some reason, the generations of people who've been out in those islands practicing those crafts for as many generations as they have do not qualify as indigenous people whose cultural practices, as this is, are not worthy of respect?
Hello and welcome. I'm Zahra Sethna, and I'm the host of the Collapse Life podcast, a thinking person's guide to civilization and demise. I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the words growing scientific consensus, I brace myself for what's about to come. Well, the latest consensus being thrust on us is that animal agriculture needs to end in order to stop catastrophic climate change. The campaigners against eating meat are using all sorts of tactics, attacking both the supply and the demand side, and not just here in America, but all over the world. Joining us today from London, England, to talk about some of these tactics and the ideology that underpins them is David Bean of the Countryside Alliance. Welcome,
Hello,
David. Looking
Zara.
forward to this. Hi.
Thank
Great.
you. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's so nice to have you, and I know you're having a very warm day over there in London.
We are just a little, it's true.
That's good. Well, it is summer, so good for you. So just as I alluded to in the intro, let's start by just kind of unpacking the argument that animals and livestock are contributing to climate change. So in my understanding, the narrative is something like this, that as the global population rises, consumption of meat and dairy is expected to increase. And so with all the extra cattle needed to meet that rising demand, they're going to be contributing to an excess of heat trapping emissions, and that is just going to doom us all. Have I got it right?
Yes, that's part of it, certainly. And then they also get into issues surrounding land use as well, because depending upon the methods of animal agriculture that are being used, potentially there is land that is being used to grow fodder for livestock that could,
Hmm.
they argue, potentially be given over to production of crops, potentially meaning that you could end up producing more calories per acre of land, shall we say. But for reasons that we'll doubtless get onto, that's a bit of a simplistic story, and it overlooks an awful lot of the real picture.
Right. Well, let's get into that. So, is there any evidence to bear out the claim that animal agriculture is a big source of emissions?
Well, it's interesting that you ask about the evidence, because clearly I come to this from a United Kingdom perspective, and we have within the UK one of the best food and farming systems in the world when it comes to things like environmental sustainability and animal welfare. So the difficulty that we face when we come up against the sorts of evidence that and in many cases these are people who come from a background of wanting to favor animal rights, wanting to push veganism down people's throats, and frankly, the climate argument is the latest excuse that they've come to do that. But when we look at the type of evidence that they want to bring forward on the climate, on the environmental impacts, they are constantly referring to global-based statistics. They will look at what is the amount of emissions for the production of, shall we say, a given weight of beef or perhaps lamb or some other meat product. And then they will claim that that is sort of the objective circumstance and situation that's faced everywhere. But of course it isn't, because
Mhm.
the way that we conduct our agriculture here in the United Kingdom performs on all of those measures a great deal better than the global average.
Mhm.
Also looking at issues such as the intensivity of the farming, which we may very well come on to. We don't tend to go in for those greatly intensive farming schemes that are prevalent in other parts of the world. And so, effectively, we are arguing against an evidence base that is not really applicable to agriculture as it's being practiced here. Now, I must admit, I'm not necessarily an expert on the way that agriculture is conducted in other parts of the world. And, it may be that they have, depending upon local conditions, a more or less valid argument in different countries. But certainly coming at it from a United Kingdom perspective, the evidence that they use is skewed by this over-reliance on global average figures that aren't relevant locally here.
Right. And obviously, the way cattle are raised in Namibia is going to be very different than Brazil and the United States and the UK. So just kind of taking a broad brush at a global level is going to be difficult. But so you make the case for the UK and Scotland having a more sustainable agriculture system. So you mentioned intensivity. What are the other aspects that make your agriculture system more sustainable in your estimation?
Well, one of them is the fact that in the United Kingdom, particularly in Scotland, which is where I come from, there is an awful lot of land that if it's going to be put to agriculture, it's only going to be suitable for either providing pasture for animals to graze on, or in some cases, it might be able to produce enough usable grass that it can be harvested and turned into hay, which of course is only actually used for animals at all. It's often said, you sometimes hear it say that a cow is a wonderful machine which converts grass into food, because of course human beings can't eat grass. We just can't digest it. We don't have the ability. But the biological makeup of a cow means that it's precisely suited to doing that. So if you have a situation where land actually can't be turned over to the production of crops that are edible by humans, then quite obviously it will be comparatively more sustainable to continue to use that land for livestock farming, because there's no other way that you can use that land to produce food.
Right. So there's so many threads to pull here, and I want to be kind of systematic about our conversation. But one of the things that climate activists are calling for is to actually take that land that you're describing, which is really only suitable for either grazing animals or growing feed for animals, and switching it over to plant-based alternatives. All land is not created equal. So obviously, as you say, rocky land with very little topsoil is not going to be suitable for growing crops, and not every place has the same amount of water available to grow crops. So another alternative that the climate activists are pushing is to actually just rewild that land. Can you explain what they mean by that?
They can mean different things. It's a bit of a catch-all expression, but the general idea is that you stop involving humans in the management of that land in any way, and you allow it to return to whatever state it ends up being in, were it not for human intervention. That is the sort of the baseline, shall we say, definition of it. There are, I mean, sometimes they will try to finesse it by saying, well, actually, we do want some management of land. We would like to continue management for the purposes of biodiversity, for example. And just as in the United Kingdom, we very frequently hear the expression climate crisis. We are increasingly starting to hear the term nature or biodiversity crisis come on as well. And it is true that in order for certain species to have the opportunity to thrive, there definitely does need to be a degree of management of the land, so that those different species can be promoted.
In a place like the UK, where land is limited, you're an island essentially. So, in a scenario like that, if land was given over to either to conservation or to a different kind of agriculture, where would the food come from? Because already the UK imports, I think, according to government statistics, 46% of its food. So would that be feasible in your estimation?
Well, I think that's exactly the challenge, to be honest with you. The food has to be produced somewhere. We need to, ultimately, we need a certain number of, a certain amount of calories to feed our population. And if we're not producing it domestically, then, as you rightly say, it has to be imported. But that, of course, even importing food is not. If you leave out the financial elements to it, is not morally cost free either. Because clearly, if one country suddenly massively increases its reliance on imports, then that's going to have knock on consequences on world food prices and on people in countries where they already struggle to feed themselves. So I think it's fundamentally bizarre to be saying that it is in any way an ethical policy to be reducing the amount of food that is produced here in the United Kingdom and instead to be relying on imports.
Right. And there's a huge climate footprint that comes with importing food as well.
Absolutely, yes, you have the climate impact of the transport.
Right. So, around the time of the UN climate conference in Scotland back in 2021, COP26, there was something introduced by Edinburgh City Council, which was called a plant-based treaty. So, I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about that, what it was, how it was introduced, and what kinds of things were included in it.
Sure. Well, the plant-based treaty originally is not an initiative of Edinburgh. Actually, it's an initiative that's being put forward by an NGO. They call themselves the Plant-Based Treaty or sometimes the Plant-Based Movement, but they are effectively an offshoot of an animal rights group. It's an organization which started off in Canada. And so the document that they produced is something that they describe as a treaty, but in terms of international law, that's not what it is at all. I mean, we all know what treaties are. They're agreements between states that have certain objectives that those states pledge to fulfill. But in fact, this initiative hasn't been signed up to by any state. It's not an agreement between one and any other states, and effectively, what it is just a set of objectives, a charter. Actually, they rather grandly use the term "these are our demands,"
So, it's a
which
manifesto.
indeed, yes, absolutely. It's the things that they're campaigning for. So what happened in Edinburgh? And by the way, Edinburgh wasn't actually the first local government body, either in the United Kingdom or in the world, to have signed up to this. But it caught our attention because I think up to that point it was probably the most high-profile local authority, certainly in the UK, that had signed up to it. And so it commits the council to implement a rather long list of policies that are designed at attacking animal agriculture and attacking the consumption of meat and dairy products. So, if we look at what's actually in this document, in this charter, we see numerous things that seem incoherent and seem as though they don't make very much sense. So, for example, the key pledge is to reduce and to refuse to permit any expansions of animal agriculture facilities, meaning animal farms and meaning slaughterhouses. But of course, if, as these people claim, one of your objectives is the promotion of animal welfare, then the last thing you want to do is to start shutting down slaughterhouses and preventing new ones from opening up, because the opening of newer, more locally based slaughterhouses reduces the distance that an animal has to travel before it's slaughtered. Therefore, given that time spent traveling to slaughter is generally reckoned not to be particularly welfare positive for an animal, you would end up worsening welfare for them. And then you also would increase on transport costs, going back to the climate angle, which is what they claim is their objective in pushing this forward. There is another objective that they have, where they say that they want to respect indigenous rights. Now, they don't, people who talk about indigenous rights in the global sense very seldom trouble to explain what exactly they mean by that, who they consider to be indigenous people. I mean, to give you an example, I was out in the Western Isles of Scotland earlier this year. On the Isles of Lewis and Harris. And that's where it's the only place in the world where you can produce Harris tweed, one of the
Mm.
finest and best reputed fabric products that you can acquire anywhere in the world at this point. And that, of course, is made from the wool of sheep. And it's a traditional craft, and it's been going back generation upon generation. Now, are we to say that for some reason, the generations of people who've been out in those islands practicing those crafts for as many generations as they have do not qualify as indigenous people whose cultural practices, as this is, are not worthy of respect? So, and if that's the case, then how can we, in any objective measure, define which peoples constitute indigenous peoples who are worthy of that degree of respect? So, that also seems to be somewhat incoherent because, of course,
Yeah.
obviously, in order for them to continue producing wool, there needs to be a great many sheep on the island as they are, and those sheep need to be farmed.
Mhm.
And the way that things work out there, you have small holdings a lot of the time where people might potentially put it to different uses over time. So,
Mhm.
anytime under this policy, if it were to be introduced, anytime somebody decided that actually for the next 5 years I don't want my small holding to be producing sheep, maybe I want to do something else on it, like plant a wildflower meadow, etc., then having done that, at no point in the future would it be permissible to take it back into the production of sheep, which again, it makes zero sense. But I think really the worst of it, and the area that we highlighted most strongly as being frankly reprehensible, was that in signing up to this treaty, this so-called treaty, an
Mhm.
authority pledges that it will, over time, phase out the serving of meat and dairy in its schools, its hospitals, its prisons, and its nursing homes. So think about that for a minute. Often the way things work in the United Kingdom, some of the elderly care facilities are run by local authorities. So it's an area that was genuinely within the purview of Edinburgh City Council as a body to
Mm.
introduce a policy such as this. But it tends to be the people who come from backgrounds where they've had lower incomes who end up in the council-run facilities. So
Mhm.
essentially, what they are saying is that if you are one of these people, having lived, perhaps 70, 80 years on a varied diet, on an omnivorous diet, including meat and dairy as well as plant-based products in your diet just routinely, all of a sudden a council bureaucrat is going to get to say, actually, we've decided that we now know better, and that you're eating the occasional burger is not going to be good enough for the planet where we're concerned, so we're not going to allow you to do it anymore. I mean, it's
Mhm.
reprehensible, frankly. And so, that's why you might want to ask me about some of the things that we've done to combat this organization. But that will be a flavor for you, I suppose, as to the reasons why we object so strongly to this initiative and the group behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of threads to pull there. I don't know who's listening to this conversation, but I think you just planted a seed potentially for plant-based tweed as a growing industry.
Well, they wouldn't be able to market it as Harris tweed, I can assure you.
Just a little bit of a joke there. But so I did want to pick up though on the last point that you made about banning meat from schools and nursing homes and things like that, because you're essentially by doing so just taking away um, personal choice. You're taking away the ability for people to eat what they like. And so talk about not only the implications of a decision like that on personal liberty, but also on health, especially, since this is also being implemented in schools. So for growing children who need a nice balanced diet, what are the implications there?
Yes, I think when it comes to schools, it is particularly relevant because obviously, if somebody's living in a care home, shall we say, then it's expected that their entire dietary needs would be met by that home. So there would be a degree of planning that could be done to try to make sure that the dietary needs of the people there were being properly met. But with schools, that's not quite the same sort of situation. Typically, a child will only eat one or possibly two meals every day at school. Almost always, it's only the lunches, um, and so. In effect, that school lunch is an important component of the child's overall diet, and as you point out, this is at a time when they are growing, when they're also experiencing a great deal of intellectual stimulation. I mean, that's the idea of being at school, after all. And so they need to have a diet that allows them to do both, really, to have clarity of thought and to have the ability to continue to grow. And if they're being denied the opportunity ever to have meat during that midday meal, then there are questions as to what sort of impact that might have on their overall diet. And that's especially true in situations where parents aren't consulted on what's going on and what schools are proposing to do in this regard. Because, while I certainly would be one of those parents who said that we didn't want to have the child's diet restricted in that way, others might take a different view. But if they wanted to do that, then they would have to have some thinking about what sorts of foods were being served in the home to make sure that the child's diet remained balanced on the whole. So that there was perhaps additional protein in the morning and evening meals, if that was something where there was a concern that there might otherwise be a deficiency. Similarly, around certain vitamins that we know are particularly bioavailable in meats, and not so much in plant-based products. Where are they going to get that from? Well, those are the sorts of things that the parent would have to start planning around. But of course, they can't do that if they don't even know that it's happened in the first place.
And that's one of the things that your organization has picked up on, and because this is not just a theory, this is actually happening around the UK, isn't it? And you have discovered that actually in some cases the parents were not informed.
Exactly. Yes, there have been cases, not necessarily introduced under the auspices of a move to support for the plant-based treaty as we've been discussing. Although it's certainly one of the measures that, if an organisation did sign up to that plant-based treaty, that they would ultimately be being expected to do. But just as an independent initiative, yes, we have seen cases across the UK of schools starting to introduce effectively unilateral plant-based policies on their school meals. And indeed, as you say, a lot of the time the parents weren't even aware, never mind having been consulted or asked to consent on it.
Hmm. So we've talked a little bit here about some of the efforts to change the demand side, and there's actually been so much propaganda amongst younger generations that probably if you asked children, they would quickly sign up to not eating meat because they've been told about the climate crisis that they're growing up in, and also this animal cruelty argument. But let's also talk about the supply side. And I know that you have had some of these conversations and countered, like you did just now, that there may be an argument for large commercial agriculture being a contributor to environmental damage, but on the smaller scale regenerative side, there's actually a benefit to the environment. But they don't seem to, that they being the other side of the argument, the climate activists that you talk to, the proponents of these policies, they don't even seem to want to accept that argument that there is maybe a better way of doing agriculture that still allows meat to be in the mix. Why do you think that is?
Yes, that's right. I think the answer as to why it is actually quite simple, and I started to allude to it a little earlier on. I believe that for a great many of the people who are campaigning against animal agriculture and against the consumption of meat and dairy are using environmental arguments as an excuse. Frankly, I think that these people fundamentally are motivated by the same animal rights message that led them to become vegans in the first place, and that effectively they would be advocating for, regardless of whether there were any environmental issue there or not. So, frankly, I think that climate change is being prayed in aid, shall we say, by the activists, whose real objective is to effectively make everybody become vegan because they don't like the idea of animals being raised and slaughtered for food. Now,
Right.
that's an argument that I vehemently disagree with, but it's an honest argument. It's a respectable argument. What I don't think is quite so respectable is when you use arguments that are of dubious applicability, shall we say, as we've been discussing earlier on, to
Mhm.
try to add a make weight to a case that existed already. And I think that's really what they've done with the climate change and the overall environmental arguments against livestock farming.
Right. So it's a difference between animal welfare, which is what you're saying. There are ways to do this that are more humane and more focused on the welfare of the animal, versus animal survival. That no animal should ever be used in this way. So there's no argument to be made of protecting their welfare. It's just taking it off the table completely.
Indeed. Well, the distinction I would draw is between animal welfare, as you started off by mentioning there, and animal rights. And so this is the idea that animals have moral rights that are put them on a level equivalent to that of a human being. And, for all sorts of reasons, I'm a philosophy graduate myself. I can say that there are
Mhm.
immense problems with that basic proposition. The idea that an animal should have the capacity to hold on to an ethical right that is equivalent to that which a human might have simply is incoherent in itself. Effectively, if animals did have rights, supposing an animal had a right not to be killed, then that right would impose a similar obligation on other animals. It wouldn't only impose an obligation on humans. It would mean you would
Right.
say that animals are now existing within a moral framework that has no distinction from humans. Therefore, animals would be required to respect the rights of one another, which they are simply
Mhm.
incapable of doing.
Right. Right. How do you penalize a predator for violating the rights of prey in that
Exactly.
framework? Right. So,
Exactly. I mean, especially considering that a great many animals end up being, or are in fact, obligate carnivores in any case. They can't survive. Humans can, just about survive without eating meat, but there are certain species of animals, cats, as a classic example, that simply cannot live without having a component of meat in their diets.
mhm. Yeah. So, as you said, it's a sort of non-starter of an argument because it falls apart quite quickly. Um, but the alternative, as you started to say, is smaller, more decentralized production and processing. Um, and that is also becoming increasingly difficult. I know here in America, there are onerous regulations being put on small producers who want to grow in a particular way, managed themselves in a regenerative or sustainable way, and then bring their products directly to market. Is the same sort of thing happening in Britain? Are farmers there also feeling the same sort of pressure? I know we're hearing about what's happening in other parts of Europe, particularly the Netherlands. So talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK.
Well, the truth is that when farmers talk about the actions of government in the United Kingdom, the complaint generally tends to be less about over-regulation and more about the somewhat onerous requirements that farmers have to meet in order to qualify for certain subsidies. And the fact is, globally speaking, agriculture simply is a heavily subsidized activity. The reason being, effectively, farmers need incomes that are higher than they would be able to get selling food at prices that consumers are going to be politically accepting of paying when they go into the supermarket. I mean, ultimately, an agricultural subsidy ultimately boils down to a price subsidy in the supermarket
Mhm.
because it's what allows production to continue at the rates it is at in order for prices to be as low as they are in supermarkets. And obviously, I understand that for a lot of people, supermarket prices don't feel particularly low.
Hmm.
And certainly of late, we've seen considerable food price inflation. But nevertheless, they are a heck of a lot lower, even so, than they would be were it not for the extensive agricultural subsidies that we see. So, to my understanding, where British farmers complain about onerous regulations, it's because of the somewhat limiting designs of the various subsidy schemes that they would be able to access, and the number of hoops that they have to jump through
Hmm.
in seeking to qualify for those schemes.
But now with subsidies, I mean, for generations, certainly here in the US and probably for even longer in the UK, there weren't government subsidies and people grew their own food and they sold their excess to others who needed it. And there was no government involvement at all. So are you saying that subsidies are now necessary because of the sake of we have a larger population now, or it needs to be distributed differently? Because subsidies then come with strings attached, and the government decides which industries or which crops should be subsidized and not, so that there's an incentive to grow a certain thing because you're going to get the money from the government. So there's a whole kind of knock-on effect there.
Hmm. Yes, it causes difficulties, certainly, and it can distort the market. But I think ultimately, yes, I mean, you are right that our population, when compared with the days before agricultural subsidies regimes, our population is incomparable to those days, incomparably larger, I mean. And so there are so many more mouths to feed. You also see the effects of global trade. I mean, effectively, by on a point of sheer logistics, it is possible to trade food to and from literally any part of the world. I mean, clearly there are political factors in that increasingly that restrict what's actually possible. But yes, on a logistical level, there's no reason why you couldn't trade food between anywhere. So it's not just a domestic market for demand of food that we're looking at now; it's a global market there. But on the other side of things, and this I think also going back to another reason why it is foolish to talk about cutting out domestic production of food in order to rely more heavily on imported food is, we have to remember the food production sector is a strategic sector. Ultimately, we have to have a degree of capacity in food production so that were the global political situation to change radically, we would have ultimately the ability to feed ourselves.
Yeah.
During the Second World War, for example, that was the last time when we really had very limited abilities to import just about any food into the United Kingdom. And in those days, you had the Digging for Victory campaign,
Yeah.
where the people were tearing up their lawns, they tore up golf courses. Any bit of potentially productive land that people in those days could get their hands on, they were turning over to food production because it was an absolute necessity.
Mhm.
Now, the UK government doesn't believe, well, certainly the last UK government didn't believe, and I've seen no evidence that the current government that was elected a couple of weeks ago takes a different view. UK governments generally don't believe that we need to strive for self-sufficiency
Mhm.
in food, as in the ability to feed ourselves entirely through food produced in the United Kingdom. The governments anticipate that there will always be scope for some degree of global trade. But of course, as we've seen within the past couple of years, that does conceal that there is scope for a great deal of disruption in global food supply, particularly the war in Ukraine, it having been one of the breadbaskets of Europe when it came particularly to grain production. And the fact that its neighbor decided to try to invade the place had an immense impact on food prices. And in fact, a lot of the food price inflation that we've seen stems from that. I think when we talk about subsidies, we have to see it against this quite a complicated backdrop, really, in terms of all of the factors that go into what a country's policy is going to be towards its food and farming. You know, much as I would sympathise with a free market argument in a lot of cases, I think that the complexities of the situation when it comes to food will go some way to explaining how we came to be here where we are with such a degree of reliance on subsidies regimes.
What is your kind of vision for a resilient future for the UK?
Well, I think that the first thing that needs to happen is that I think society needs to become more aware about how food is produced,
Mhm.
and about what goes into that. And that leads on to the fact that realistically there needs to be a great deal more knowledge and awareness of farming as a sector,
Mhm.
and also of respect for the farmers. I mean, there's a very interesting quotation. I don't have the exact words on it, but this was said on UK television recently. It was said that you may need a doctor once a year. You may need a fireman once in your life, or hopefully never.
Mhm.
But you can't survive without a farmer 3 times a day. And
Mhm.
ultimately, I think that's what people need to realize. And that when there is a politics that seeks to impose policies on rural areas from urban areas over the heads of the people who live and work there, then that is what I would see as being particularly dangerous. There
Mhm.
needs to be involvement from rural people in the development of policy, because ultimately they are the ones who are doing that vital work to produce the food that we rely on and to manage the environments of the countryside.
Mhm. One little peek that we here in the US have had into farming in the UK, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but there was this TV program, Clarksons Farm. So Jeremy Clarkson of Top Gear fame, wealthy TV star, lots of money, bought lots of land, and tried his hand at farming. And from watching the show, even someone like him who has influence and money, he found it difficult to get all the permissions and permits he needed to be a viable farm business.
Everything's ready to go. I just need West Oxfordshire District Council to say, good idea.
The applicant's conduct is shameful. It indicates a give me an inch and I'll take a mile attitude.
Shit.
So I don't know if you've seen that show, but in your
Oh,
estimation,
I'm well aware of it, I can
okay,
assure you.
was that just a little bit of reality TV drama, or does what we saw in that show reflect the actual challenges of farmers?
It does, yes, because I mean, leaving aside the what's presented on the show, we regularly hear stories in the media about this because he's still working on it. You know, he doesn't stop working just because the cameras aren't rolling.
Right.
Uh, he keeps going, and he's had particular battles with the local council over the development of some of his subsidiary businesses. He wanted to put in a farm shop cum
Mhm.
cafe, and was being denied planning permission,
Mhm.
despite the fact that this was on land that had already been developed. So, in fact, not too long before the general election, the UK government put forward a policy that would have made that sort of situation easier. It was referred to in the media in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way as Clarksons Law, because it was designed to ease up on some of that bureaucratic
Right.
burden that farmers face when they're trying to change the use of some of their plant from one thing to another.
Um, so are you seeing, like we are seeing here in the US, there those kinds of regulations and those kinds of challenges are causing some farmers to actually kind of go outside of the lines a little bit and using innovative ways to get their products into the hands of consumers that that don't force them down these onerous regulations routes. So direct to consumer kind of clubs, buying clubs and herd shares and things like that. Are you seeing similar things in the UK? Do you have any examples that's come to mind?
Yes, we certainly are. I mean, ultimately, what farmers are trying to do is, well, a couple of things really. First of all, diversification, getting themselves more revenue streams. But secondly, trying to retain as much of the added value in themselves as possible. So, one example would be that we've had quite a lot of startup brands in sweet dairy products and in ice cream. So things like yogurts and various other puddings. And these are being started up by not particularly large dairy farms because they want the opportunity with farm gate prices for milk being not particularly high. They want the opportunity to capture more of the value and more of the component of the price that's paid by the end consumer. And the way they're doing that is simply by forward processing the products themselves.
Right. Given how globalized our world is, just because the general election happened in the UK, the things that happen there are not going to just affect people in your country. And very often, the kinds of things that come out of the UK will then spill over into Canada, into Australia, and here in the United States as well. And we've also, as you know, got our elections coming up. So what insights do you have? What do you think we might be seeing? And are there any trends that are happening in the UK that you think might start crossing over and we see them over here?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I suppose, comparatively speaking, between the United Kingdom and the USA, if there is a change of the political direction of government in the USA, then it would be in the opposite direction to what we've just seen in the United Kingdom. You would be supplanting a left of centre presidency with a right of centre presidency, whereas we've just done the reverse in terms of the political direction of the governments. So I don't know whether it's going to be directly comparable there. What will, of course, be fascinating to see is how Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, and his team are able to get on with former President Trump were he to be elected. And certainly, well, you will be reading the same polls as I am, no doubt, and that at the moment would seem like the more likely outcome from this election.
Yeah.
So, we've had very good relations between the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the current President Joe Biden. But how well will it work the other way when you've got a Labour Prime Minister and a Republican president? Well, in the past, it's been fine. Tony Blair was famously immensely close to George Bush Jr.
Yeah.
But of course, I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump is a fairly idiosyncratic character. And not necessarily known for being universally well liked by everybody who ever meets him. So, there may be some challenges there.
Right. And given what you just said, that, there doesn't seem to be much of a focus in this new government on rural areas, do you think that might spell a sort of short-lived government for Starmer? Do you think you might be back to the polls soon?
Well, Sir Keir Starmer just won a landslide majority in this election. What I was saying about rural areas is that because of the sheer scale of the victory that they had, they now find themselves representing more rural seats than they have done for generations. However, I mean, frankly, even if all of the rural Labour MPs decided never so much as to turn up to Parliament, Starmer would still be looking at one of the, I mean, he's got a bigger majority than Tony Blair had after the landslide in 1997. So I think that there is precisely zero risk of Starmer's government falling anytime soon.
Right. Well, you've got your work cut out for you, I guess, over the next couple of years, putting those issues back into their purview. So are there any other points that you'd like to make, anything that I haven't asked, or last words you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think the only last words that I would like to end this broadcast on would be words of thanks to the farming community, to the people who go to such extensive efforts to put the food on our plates that we rely on for our survival. And that goes to farmers, any farmers who may be watching or listening wherever you are. Be you in the United Kingdom, be you in the United States, be you in another country. And similarly, whatever type of farmer you are too, and the last thing that I would want is for the spirited defense of livestock farming, of meat and dairy farming that I try to put up, be seen as any kind of slight on arable farming or arable farmers. They're all a massive and important and vital part of the overall picture. But I think that what we see from the other side of the argument, the activists that we were discussing earlier on, is not motivated by that same degree of respect and isn't motivated by that same degree of concern for the importance of putting food on people's plates. And I think ultimately that's what we all need to realize.
I think that's a great message to end on. Just before we go, just remind people how they can learn more and follow your work and the work of the Countryside Alliance.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, the organization that I work for, as I said, it's the Countryside Alliance. We have a website. The website is now on the screen. So if you go there, you will see links to all of our work. I do a lot of work in terms of briefing politicians a lot of the time, but everything that we put together goes on our website and is available to the general public. So anything that we put together can be found. There are links as well to our social media accounts there on the website. And if for any reason anyone would like to follow me on Twitter, well, my handle's just been on the screen there as well.
That's great. Great. Well, David, thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing all your insights and time with us. We're really grateful.
Thank you very much, Zahra.
We're so lucky to have guests like David come on and share their perspectives. And we're also so grateful to viewers like you for being here and for showing us your support. If you haven't already, please go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you can be the first to hear about all our latest updates. Collapse Life is here to help open eyes and give people the tools they need to take control of their lives. We're on Substack at collapselife.substack.com, and we put out news stories there every week. We're also on Twitter at collapse_life, and we have some great products in our Collapse Life store, so please go ahead and check that out. And then head on back here next week for another episode of this podcast. We'll be sure to have another amazing guest, and we look forward to seeing you. And until then, keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.